ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another edition of World Talks here on TVP World, where every word matters. I'm your host, Benjamin Lee. Please join me and my guests on this next interview. The Alternative for Germany has secured a victory in Thuringia, winning 32.8% of the vote, marking the first such success for a far-right party in Germany since the 1930s. Now, this result, coupled with strong showing in Saxony, poses significant challenges for German Chancellor Olaf Scholz's center-left coalition. The AFD's anti-immigration stance and economic grievances have resonated with voters, particularly the youth. Joining us today on TVP World to discuss the implications of these results is Professor Maciej Kisilowski, Associate Professor at Central European University. Hello, sir, and welcome to TVP World.
Good morning.
So we are looking at the rise of the AFD party, and before we dive into the politics, let's start with some of the most recent developments, because one of the leaders of the AFD party, Weidel, in the publication La Repubblica, actually coined the word, well, don't even know how to pronounce it, but Dexit, DW, which means Germany, with the combination of exit. First of all, being hard to pronounce aside, how do you think this word is being termed, and how valid do you think is as a threat going forward?
Well, let's put it in proportion. I often think that we can divide the threat of authoritarian right in Europe into sort of three categories. The first I would call maybe not small, because authoritarian threat is never small, but maybe let's call it noticeable. When the authoritarian parties have about up to 20% of popular support. And Germany was in this category, and nationally it still is. AFD nationally has about 18%. Scandinavian countries are in a similar group. Then you have a more worrisome support group. For example, in the country I'm speaking from, Austria, will have election in a few weeks, and the FPO, far-right party here, has about a third of support. And in Germany, we saw in two of those states, lands that you mentioned, Thuringia and Saxony, they went through this small, noticeable category to the worrisome category of about a third of support. But I want to put it in perspective, especially since we are on a Polish TV, that there is also a third group, which I would call alarming support, where the extreme authoritarian right parties have about half of popular support. And unfortunately, Poland is in that category. We saw it in the recent election in the European Parliament, when the authoritarian right-wing parties, Law and Justice and Confederacja, together got almost half of the vote, 48%. So I would like to put it all in perspective. We should be worried about Thuringia and Saxony. We should be worried about 18% of far-right support in Germany, but especially since we are on Polish TV station, we should put it in context that there are countries like Poland where the support for authoritarian Eurosceptic extreme radical right is way higher. And France, of course, is somewhere in the middle, about a third, supported Marine Le Pen in a recent parliamentary election. So it's still much higher than in Germany. So, of course, a sign of concern, an uptick of support, but not majority. It's plurality even in Thuringia and Saxony, and certainly, unfortunately, compared to other European EU nations, it's not the leader, so to say, in the far-right support.
Right, I hear what you're saying when it comes to the numbers. There's an argument to be made that there's still very much room to maneuver. However, when we look at the trend, so I would say that it could be a little bit worrying, as we are seeing the rise in number of these support for these parties. In France, like you mentioned, Le Pen has secured a lot of support over just a very short period of time, and the rise of the AFD party is also something that has been sprouting up instead of Poland, for example, where they might have been taking a downturn as seen by recent local elections. So do you think that it is something to keep an eye out for, even though it's not the majority right now? Maybe the trend that is going that way is something that needs to, deserves further dissection.
You're absolutely right. And not only because of the eventual risk, which we saw in Poland, that, the numbers are growing and suddenly they become majority, like in 2015 in Poland, and we have a true constitutional crisis when authoritarian parties take over. But also, even before we reach this critical point, you can see a certain unfortunate reactions from mainstream parties, which are understandable, but still quite unfortunate. Yes? So first of all, when you have this smallest support, the smallest group, below 20%, generally the policy of many European parties was cordoning off the populists. So basically what you described in the material preceding our interview, which is nobody wants to work with populists, we do grand coalitions. That's of course good, in a short run, but in the longer run, it creates kind of a situation of choiceless democracy when voters see that all those mainstream parties, from social democrats to Christian democrats, kind of band together just to oppose the populists. And of course, that creates a lot of resentment, can lead to more populist support. Yes, that is why recently you saw another trend, of course, in the Netherlands, in Scandinavian countries, and potentially soon in Austria, which is to incorporate populists into coalition government so that they have at least a little bit of blame for governing and responsibility. But of course, that is a very dicey proposition, especially in Germany. We know historically that that's how Nazism started, yes, with Christian Democrats hoping to incorporate the Nazis in a coalition government in the 30s, and it went very badly. So of course, we should be worried about this. And the final negative trend that you can see with this worrisome uptick, as you called it, of populist support, is that mainstream parties can incorporate parts of populist agenda into their own agenda. So, for example, mainstream parties start kind of aping populists and behaving like populists on certain issues, especially migration. Of course, we see this interesting example of a new left-wing party in Germany by Sarah Wagenknecht that is following this route, trying to be kind of democratic and socialist on economic issues, but anti-immigrant. But it's not the first case of this. We of course have the Danish Prime Minister Mette Frederiksen, social democrat, who is very anti-immigration, very hard on immigration. So we see this so-called extremist mainstreaming of extremist policies as another trend. So a lot of risks, even at those lower levels of support.
Right, I want to go to what you just mentioned there, people feeling like there's perhaps a choiceless democracy. I think that is very crucial. A lot of our guests have been telling us that the rise of the AFD perhaps is a result for the previous years where they feel like whichever way they elect, eventually after the coalition building exercises, we end up with Angela Merkel, like it or not. And do you think that this is going to be an issue going forward? Like we see in France, even though eventually Le Pen's party did not win much, was barred from governance because of the political horse trading, coalition building inside the country, we do see a very high number in support. And can you help us understand how to go about tackling the situation?
Yes, so of course, and Poland is another example where a lot of people are, as we know, not very satisfied with the current grand coalition. People on the left think it should be more socially progressive. People on the center-right think that they are being blackmailed by the left. But of course, if you do believe that the opposition, Law and Justice and Confederacja are fundamentally authoritarian parties, you don't have a choice. You need to vote for the democratic parties because the alternative is even worse, yes? So this is a problem, and it goes higher and higher and more acute the stronger the anti-democratic, anti-European populist parties are. What to do with it? Well, fundamentally, fundamentally, you need to address the reasons why people support anti-democratic parties, and I think the mainstream parties are not doing enough to address those concerns. And the second thing, which I think is really important, is you really need to start distinguishing between policies with which you disagree, maybe right-wing conservative policies with which many progressives or liberals may disagree, and that's perfectly fine. But that's something different from parties which constitute a genuine threat to democracy. And my worry and my observation is that in Europe, we too often conflate those two things. So whenever we disagree with a conservative political movement, we accuse them of being anti-democratic. Yes, and that is that's going to alienate voters, because there are many conservative voters in Europe, not only in Germany, not only in Austria, not only in Poland, especially in rural areas, less urban areas, and they want to have their voice heard. They don't want to be stigmatized. They don't want to be always called a threat to democracy. And one way to achieve this, I think, by mainstream politicians is to have genuinely democratic conservative politicians who can express conservative ideas without being attacked, without being stigmatized. Of course, debate is the nature of democracy, and those of us who are more progressive, more liberal, should debate the ideas of conservatives. But we can't always brand any conservative or right-wing policy a threat to democracy. I think this is very dangerous, very alienating.
Right, and I think this is also seen in the very polarizing nature of the politics we're seeing across the world right now. It's such a worrying trend indeed. Last but not least, I would also like to explore the reason as of, well, when we see this election cycle in Germany, we are seeing a lot of voter turnout, same as in France. And the interesting phenomenon is that the youth vote is actually going into these more radical parties. Do you think a lot of these kind of youth votes are due to economic grievances, or are there reasons behind that?
Well, if you look even more closely, it's usually the male young vote that goes to those parties. So I do believe that economics play a role, but we don't have a big crisis. We have, of course, we have had painful inflation, but not any major crisis. So I would actually not look only in economic material reasons for the support of the right. I think also social issues, the feeling, maybe the fear of young men of losing their traditional social status, privileges, social roles that men, especially in rural areas, have held for traditionally. And I think this shows in those results, when you have this almost dystopian picture of women between 18 and 29 voting for left-wing progressive green parties, and men in the same age group voting for these far-right conservatives. I think we need to acknowledge that there are social and cultural reasons, and not always look at the pocketbook issues. They are important, but they are not the only things that drive political behavior.
All right, definitely a lot of aspect needs to be concerned when it comes to politics, and whether or not these issues will be addressed or we'll continue to see polarization definitely is something to look out for. Thank you so much for your input and insight. Really appreciate it. Thanks for being with us on TVP World.
Thank you.
And thank you for watching this edition of World Talks. But for more news, update, and commentary, please stay tuned to TVP World.